Okay, so the first thing that I would like to share with you is a PowerPoint that I put together on this topic of boundaries. And again, boundaries can be a lot of things. So let me tell you about the background that I'm coming from with it. My name is Irene Willis Hassan, and I am the Minister for Refugee and Migration Services at UCC National Ministries. My background is I've worked as a social services chaplain for most of my career in both homeless services and refugee services. I have chaplaincy training and clinical pastoral education, which means that most of the boundary understanding I have is under the chaplaincy belt. However, I'm also a student of social work. I'm actively getting my Master of Social Work degree right now. All of the data that I'll be pulling up comes from the social work profession. And so I hope that this will be a good overview of boundaries when working with refugees. Go ahead and pull up. Oh, and if you haven't already dropped your name, where you're at, and your congregation in the chat, that would be hugely helpful for getting to know you and how I can directly support you or anyone else in this call. Because I know that a lot of folks that are on this call are also supporting families. Okay. Sorry, like I said, I may have to pause once in a while since because of the way I put my Zoom settings. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the boundaries that are set up by the refugee resettlement system. And by boundaries, I mean expectations. In this context, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, in that the boundaries that are set up by the way that we admit refugees in the United States are super rigid. So as most of you on this call that I know have already received an Afghan family, you know that you have to find housing ASAP. That is the first expectation, is that when your refugee family gets to the United States, that they have somewhere to live. In this situation with Afghanistan, that kind of became muddled. But on a normal day in the life of refugee services, usually that housing is set up approximately a month before time, in relationship with a landlord who is aware of how the refugee office operates and is used to taking in refugees. So that timeline is usually between 1 month before arrival to ASAP. So that's the first expectation, is that they find a house. The second and every other expectation is that they find a job. That is almost immediately after they're put into the house, it's time for you to go into the workforce. So the second thing that happens is and just to back up, is how I know this is because I worked in a refugee office in Seattle and I managed the employment program. And the employment program was the most high stakes part of doing the work in a lot of ways, because the second that they had their furniture and they had their housing and they had their kids enrolled in classes, they were sent to me with a big ticking timer on them saying, now they have to get a job. And if they don't do this, everything else falls apart. So the head of household, which is usually the man, but not always, definitely not always, has to find a job immediately, or at least within the first 3 months is the expectation. And then the refugee offices generally offer supplementary services to this to assure that the job, that ticking time bomb, is accomplished. And those services can range from English training to job interview training, to a number of other things, that financial literacy training, anything that they can do with the final goal to support them to get any job that can make them self-sustainable. Because going back to this first expectation, the housing isn't very stable usually. There is not really any sort of way that refugee housing is paid for unless a grant has been given to the refugee office or a church sponsor group has agreed to pay the rent for a certain amount of time. But generally, a refugee office has funding that they received from private or foundational grants for 3 months or so for that refugee to live in that apartment until they're expected to pay that rent all by themselves. also with the supplementation of social services, but it's not that much. So I don't know if anyone has taken their refugee family to the Social Security office yet, but a refugee family is eligible for like maybe $700 a month in cash assistance, and a single refugee is only eligible for something like 300. And as we know, in most major U.S. cities, that doesn't even pay rent. So the job is super important because the services offered and the things provided do not meet the needs of having a basic income in the United States. So, and those services are offered up to 6 months, and 6 months is the absolute cap. And then they're considered ineligible for services anymore. And technically, at the end of that 6 months, if the head of household or anyone else in the house has not found the job that's going to self-sustain them, then they are transferred to homeless services. And that's the sad reality, is that the refugee office will transfer them over to a different system to be able to take care of them, put them in a shelter as needed. Now, refugee offices are full of caring, loving people that do care about their clients. They wouldn't be in the work if they didn't. So often, if a refugee surpasses that 6 month mark and they're not still on the roster of people that receive services, the refugee office will still work with them, but they can't really bill for it anymore. I explain this to you because these are the boundaries of refugee offices. The only thing is that you have to go get a job right away, and anything else that you do, they don't have the billing to care about. I won't say they don't care about it, because they certainly do, but they are restrained by an overload of cases. They're restrained by government contracts, and this is just the way that the system works out, unfortunately, which is why it's so interesting that the government in this situation with Afghanistan has opened up refugee services to private groups like yourselves to be able to take on the hosting, because it totally changes the game in how we interact with refugees, because we, the church, are not necessarily bound up by these 4 boundary markers of how to get folks into stability. Because we, the church, know, or at least I think probably many of us know, that there's a lot of trauma that accompanies a refugee coming over from the situation that they were in previously to coming to the refugee office. Refugee office workers know that as well, but again, they're restrained by the boundaries set forth by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So these are specifically the markers of trauma that almost every refugee goes through on their journey to resettlement, and wherever that might be, in this case, the United States. I've gone over this slide before in previous meetings, and that there's usually 3 points of trauma. One is the war that made them leave. The second is the process of migration, whether that's through a desert or boarding a speeding train, or on a life raft through the ocean, or in the case of Afghan refugees, jumping onto airplanes as they're moving off the airport, seeking safety. That's the second point of trauma. And the third point of trauma, which actually social workers say is the most difficult point of trauma, is the resettlement, because they are expected to work right away when they get here, in a culture that they don't understand, in a language they don't necessarily understand, with a whole system of understanding things like medical insurance and benefits and taxes and all that they don't understand. And it can be really jarring to get to the United States and be told that they have so much weight suddenly on their shoulders, and that can often be the highest point of trauma. Again, none of this is taken into account when considering how to resettle a refugee in the United States. So I pulled some quotes from an article about the dilemma of self-sufficiency, because that's what we're talking about, is the boundaries that are set forward by refugee resettlement offices, and how the final goal is self-sufficiency, being able to get on your feet with the American dream in 3 months after everything that they've gone through, from jumping on airplanes, from losing their entire family, to go work in a hotel changing bed linens. Thank you. Um, and so this just demonstrates this article, which is cited at the bottom for anyone who wants to go read the full article, just reflects what I've been talking about, that this idea of being resettled in 3 months or less, fully Americanized, it's jarring and it doesn't reflect, um, sorry, it doesn't reflect an actual ability to do so. And that it actually reinforces trauma to the migrant. Like I said, that third point of trauma is usually the worst because it re traumatizes that person to say, you found safety, but actually it's about to be a lot worse for you if you can't do this right. And then the author of this article said at the end of the article that they think that the refugee resettlement system should be adjusted to a year of services instead of 3 months. He said 1 month because that's the prime goal is 1 month, but he said it should be a year because because of all of this, right? Because it's a massive amount of trauma and change and adjustment that is just not accounted for. And so that was the goal of this article and the problem with the boundaries that refugee resettlement offices put on refugees, that we, the church and private sponsorship groups, don't necessarily have to. And I imagine that's why you're here taking this training right now, is because you may know that these points of trauma exist and that you want to care for those points of trauma and be present with them, but also acknowledge that this is the goal, right? I'm assuming that's true for many of you. Okay, so what does being trauma informed look like then? If you care about your family and you care that they've been traumatized and you want to be able to take that full year to help them adjust, how do you actually do that while also accomplishing the goals of you're in a capitalist system and you do have to be able to work and be self-sufficient? Basically, these are the six components of trauma-informed care. And those six components, in a nutshell, this is really diluting it down, but it's all about agency. It's about choice. It's about self-control. So when a person who has been through massive trauma is given autonomy over their life and told that they are the captains of their destiny and that they have the ability to become who they're meant to be, that is when a person has gone through trauma thrives. And that's what all of this is being able to welcome someone into being the captain of their own destiny, welcome someone into feeling like they are empowered, like they can move forward and be in control of their own life. That is the basic of trauma-informed care. Please remember to mute your microphone if you are not actively speaking. Otherwise, your face will pop up on the recording. Thank you. So if we do care about making sure that someone has agency, someone has choice, that takes time, right? Especially if you've been through all of that trauma and all of that pain, and your brain is probably all over the place with, this is a huge change, but again, they also have to go figure out how to find that job. Where's the balance and how do we strike that? How do we work with them to build that? So this article about boundary considerations with persons who are refugees talks about the difference between it being a transactional relationship and a relational relationship. So a transactional relationship is what you see the US government expecting of refugee offices. There's a transaction. In transaction for you to go get a job, we will assure that you have case management and you have the appropriate services set up and you can continue coming to the refugee office. That's the transaction. And we, the church, as I've been saying, don't necessarily want to operate on that because, as our friend up here said, that is not an adequate system. That's just the system that we have. It should be longer. It should be more relational. So how do we make it more relational? Well, we are the church. We are relational by nature, but doing so with people that are vastly different from us, that have had way different experiences, may be tricky because it would be really tempting to say the way that I'm going to give you agency and empower you is to let you make all of your own choices and give you everything that you need. which could totally drain yourself, and it could drain your church if folks are asking for things like, they want to have a 3-bedroom house and an Audi so that they can go drive Uber X or whatever. And these aren't outlandish things that refugees do ask for, right? These are things that that are real things that folks might ask for, which aren't things that the church can provide, right? Or that the church should provide. So the recommendation by this author is that you see it as a relationship rather than a transaction. So if you see it as I and thou rather than I and it, so the refugee is not an it that you're giving things to, right? The refugee is not a product that you are trying to manipulate. And when you give people too much stuff, that turns them into a product that you are trying to manipulate, because giving them all the things that they want isn't empowering them, it's making you feel better a lot of times. And that is a massive difference. So in all your interactions, the basis should be is, how are we both relational human beings in this conversation? And that is not an easy question about how we're relational human beings. It involves discernment, it involves prayer, it involves conversation and communication, and it's not always clear. But as long as the focus is on you are a person and I am a person, and we will figure out how to do this together so that both of our agency is fulfilled, then that is the best way to create healthy boundaries, is to make sure that that at no point does anyone become an it, as the refugee system has unfortunately put refugees into, and becoming an it. We do not have to. But that also doesn't mean that we have to become an it ourselves, right? Just because the person we are working with is a thou doesn't mean that I am not an I. I hope that makes sense. That the difference is that having a relationship in which both people are having their needs met is, of course, the best way to create a relationship. And as this author says, it's delicate, it's fragile, it's difficult to forge and maintain, can easily be damaged or destroyed. There are going to be points when you have to say, I'm sorry, or points when you have to be willing to be humble and learn more about the other person, at points in which you have to hold up your own boundaries and say, I can't do that. It's not easy to have a relationship. It's easy to have a transaction. So this is a conversation that your church needs to be intentional about exploring, is how to keep everyone in the stage of being people instead of things. Now, because that is pretty vague and involves, well, I mean, vague is the wrong word, I think. It's difficult, right? It's difficult navigating how to make sure that everyone is being appropriately filled, right? That's a big thing. So let me get a little bit more specific about ways that you can do that. Now I'm going to harken back to the job thing, and that is still important. As I said, this is still a capitalist society, and people are still expected to be products. And as tempting as it may be to walk with your refugee and say, we're going to overcome this capitalist system and we're going to change you for being a product, yes, please do that. Change your refugee from being a product. But in order to invite them into not being a product, they have to have their own sense of autonomy and agency. It can't be you doing it for them. And that's why the employment is still vitally important, because if that person has autonomy over their own finances, that person has autonomy over the ability to, they don't have to ask you for permission to buy things, right? If they can buy it themselves,
they
that
could
gives them
still
more
be coming.
Please remember to keep your microphones muted if you are not speaking, just so that the camera doesn't come to you. So this article talks about how employment is actually the best way to hold those boundaries and create empowerment. Because again, the model is that Boundaries happen best with trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed care means making choices, and that everybody involved in the relationship gets a choice and agency. And the way to do that is by focusing on the things that are both needed to survive and also help develop that person into being whole. So the six sources of resilience are social support, which is you guys, and the partnerships you make in your area, maybe mosques or so other social service partners that can help you. Acculturation, education, religion, avoidance, and hope. Now, avoidance may sound like an interesting one to throw in there in ways to be resilient, but being empowering to another person, like I said, isn't just giving them stuff and saying, I'm sorry you went through that, because that creates that person into being an it. So saying, right now is the time in which we are in survival mode, and I want to help you get out of survival mode so that we can move on to something bigger. And that means you have to go get a job. So a lot of avoidance means being able to set that aside, to be able to move forward into empowerment, which is why avoidance is included in this. Also highly important, what I've been talking about is that refugees are not passive victims. And when you just give them whatever they want because they asked for it, which, by the way, manipulation is a trauma response. But we don't want to have a cycle of manipulation, which they're manipulating you into giving them something that's not reasonable, and then you manipulate them into liking you because you gave it to them, right? So we don't want to play passive victims in this, and that the focus should be on this resilience, on that they can do this, you can do this, and we'll empower you to do so. We're not going to dump you after 3 months, and we do care about your trauma. We are willing to walk with you on that, even when it's uncomfortable. And then this article closed by saying that the best way to support these actions of resilience, to get people out of being a passive victim, of being an it, is to get them employed. Employment does a lot of things, from making them have agency over their own finances, being able to buy the things that they want, but it also puts them out into the world forcibly. So, I mean, if a person's employed, that means that they're interacting with other people around them. They're learning English organically. They're learning the culture organically. They're learning the bus system organically. Employment does a lot of things to help a person go from being a passive it into being a full agent of their own autonomy. So I threw this slide in there as well because, like I said, you know, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable having these conversations among your church and with your refugee families, but they're very important to have. So being aware that that person is working towards being full and new. That's why they're here, is they're seeking newness, but being able to be humble while you're walking in that journey and know that you're not going to know everything, and that they have gifts and beauty and strength that you may not know about, that you can learn from, are going to be paramount. So being willing to learn new things, learn a new language, learn a different way of eating. You know, I was explaining to one group, you know, it may be possible that if they invite you over for dinner, they might want to have this big plate full of food and eat it on a tarp on the floor, because that's how they're used to doing it, which isn't the way that you may be used to doing it, but opening your heart to learning new things so that you can have that exchange of agency. So they have agency. Well, you can also ask for your agency, which is to hold those boundaries. So, as you consider what boundaries your church has to offer, things to ask yourself are, am I doing this to make myself feel better, or because I'm being genuinely helpful? So let me give you an example. Maybe the mother of the family, she walks into this house that you spent so much time setting up with your American furniture and so forth, and she looks at it and she says, this isn't my home. This isn't what I'm used to. I want my things. Again, that's a trauma response, right? Is that she has lost all control over her life, and that's okay if she's disappointed, right? Because it's not okay what's happened to her. It's not okay that she's come to this point in which she's lost all of her control. So what she's really asking of you in that moment is not necessarily go get me better furniture, but what she's really asking is how do I get more of a sense of control and be myself? That's what she's actually saying to you, right? And so if you can hear what she's actually saying, you can decide for yourself, is there a way that I can help that person find more control, or am I just giving this thing to them to make them feel better? So in this example of I want better furniture that makes more sense for my lifestyle, would that person, you need to ask yourself, would buying this better furniture make me feel better? Is that for me to say, look, I gave you something? Or is that for her so that she has more control? Or would the better option to be to say, well, I am really looking forward to seeing what you create when you guys are on your feet. I don't have the answer for you. That's between you and the family that you're working with. But these are questions that you can ask yourself. And then, of course, what do I get out of this? And what does my sponsored family get out of this? Is this exchange relational or transactional? And yes, it's okay to ask yourself what you get out of this, right? Knowing your motivation is key to knowing how you're going to respond to things. If your motivation is to make yourself feel better, like you're saving this person, then you're not giving them good boundaries or yourself. But if your motivation is to learn and to work into God's wisdom and to strengthen your community, whatever it is that your motivation is, then that's the way that you can approach the other person and the things that they're asking of you. Also, what is my sponsored refugee family getting out of this? I just sort of went over that with my example is, if they, if you've made clear what your expectations are, is that you're here to support them and love them and walk with them while they're on their journey, but they have things they need to do, which includes getting a job, going to English lessons, signing up for Social Security. You're able to clarify for them that we can help you meet your needs, and asking them what those are. What are their dreams? Because this is the benefit of being the church instead of the refugee office, is we can ask them what their dreams are. Once we've gotten all of the survival basics down. And then how do I take care of my own discomfort? And the way that I recommend doing that is being in covenant with your church, being in covenant with your refugee family, and having frequent conversations about discomfort, about navigating things that are new to you. Being able to process that with other people, or in prayer, or with scripture, or with a therapist, or other tools that you can use to process the way that you interact with other human beings, because this is relational. And then, how is my plan promoting autonomy and resilience? As I said, that's the final goal of the system that, as we have it, is that autonomy is the best way to practice trauma-informed care, and resilience is the expectation that we're having in order to meet the survival needs of this family. So making sure that you keep those two things in mind as you do have these covenantal conversations with your church. This is a proposed action model. It's kind of long, but basically knowing that there's a survival plan that the refugee office put out that I outlined to you. Be clear and consistent with your congregation and with your refugee about the expectations, which should be to follow that survival plan, but also that you're not going to just follow that survival plan if you are planning to move past that. Now, if you do just want to follow the survival plan as the church laid it out, or that the refugee office laid it out for you, that's fine. That's the refugee resettlement model, right? I didn't make that up, nor did you. But being clear about what you can offer. Are you offering this person a year of walking on a journey, or are you offering them the refugee resettlement model? Also recognize that trauma is not accounted for in the system. We've gone over that. And then number 5 is to walk through with your church a covenant about how you can be clear and consistent, trauma-informed, and have a very direct way that your church and your refugee family are communicating in covenant. And then, of course, like I said, the goal is find a job. And like, because it's a capitalist economy. And even if you wish that was different, the best way to help make that different is to empower that refugee so that they're on their feet, so that when they are able to say, hey, look, we need to change the system, they can do so from their feet instead of sitting down, metaphorically. And then define clear ways that the head of household can get the job at the end of the road. So refugee offices do have a way that they, I'm going to go ahead and escape out of this. So refugee offices do have a clear way that they deal with this problem of folks being nervous to get jobs or wanting things that they can't afford because they won't get jobs. And that program is called Match Grant. So for refugees that have high employability, but they're nervous because they've been traumatized, they're nervous because they don't know the culture, they're nervous because they don't want to take a job as a janitor when they've been, a computer engineer for the last 20 years. This match grant program is meant to meet that. So a lot of refugee offices have this program in which they say, listen, if you go get this job, changing linens at a hotel, or as a security guard, or a janitor making $10 an hour that you aren't necessarily going to like, if you take that first job, then we're going to pay 6 months of your rent, and whatever savings you make, we will match it. And then as soon as you've matched up to $4,000 or $5,000 in savings, we can put another $4,000 or $5,000 in. Then you have 10,000 and you can go back to school. You can get recertified. You can open a business. You can buy a car with that money that you saved that we're matching. So it's an incentive program in which the refugee saves money at this job that they don't necessarily want just for 6 months in order to find a career path that they can actually live into and enjoy after 6 months. And the refugee offices matches that savings. So the proposal that I'm giving to you is that the refugee, or that we can replicate that. So I'd like to introduce to you that we're going to be offering a new grant, and I'll drop the link to it in the chat. It's called the Match Grant. It's based on a fund called Second Corinthians that we have at UCC National. And this fund is meant for refugee empowerment, for these exact models of refugees being able to go to school, refugees being able to get recertified or retrained in a job that they already knew how to do but aren't certified for in the US, or getting a car or other things that would help them with their self-sufficiency. And so if you have a refugee that needs incentive to go get a job because they're scared, but you're going to walk with them, then this grant may be for you, in that if that refugee takes that job that they don't necessarily want, you can say, hey, we'll match you however much you save, and then we'll apply for a grant from UCC National to match that money that you saved so that you can go back to school, so that you can get that recertification, that car, whatever it is that's going to help you become fully alive. And we're here to walk with you on that. So this is the new grant that we're offering to congregations that have refugees that are struggling with getting jobs, which again is the final marker that you need in order to create a safe and healthy boundary within the refugee system or your church. And I can talk more about that for anyone who's interested. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop that in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and open it up for you guys to ask questions about the presentation or the grant, or talk about what's going on with your congregations and your families.
Hi, everybody. I'm in Duluth, Minnesota, and we're supposed to be getting 4 young women, we're not sure from where, on Monday, the 14th. So that will be our Valentine's Day present. We are scurrying. We are working so hard to find temporary housing, to find a permanent apartment, and putting together all kinds of stuff.
But you
That's
don't know
great.
where they're from. You don't know where they're from. Are they Afghan or?
They are Afghan. And
Oh,
it's an issue that we don't know where they're from because we might need to go to the airport with coats for them because it's
oh, yeah.
cold here.
Yes, you will
It's
need.
likely that you will. Yeah.
Mhm.
Do you have any clue? Do you have
Okay. John Potts, who's also on this call, and I are in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City has received or going to receive 1,000 refugees. We're about up to 840. This is just in Oklahoma City. Tulsa is getting 800. We, per population, we are getting more Afghan refugees than any other state in the nation. Texas and Oklahoma are getting more, but per population, we have the most. We have been experienced this from ground zero on setting up two of our families on what they want. And John, and John's been on the forefront with there's about 4 of us that have been really involved in this. I have, and we have made up a list of what they want when they first get here, which is not what the Catholic Charities home apartment list says. So we can, if you can somehow give us your address in the, or email address in the chat, I can send you a copy, and anybody else that wants a copy of this list, which includes everything from carpet, if they have tile on the floors, which most of them do on apartments, to a 16-quart pressure cooker, a 30-quart bowl, and just so many, and a vacuum cleaner, which is, and a bicycle, which is what most of them want. And then from there, John, if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we realized is we didn't talk to people who had gone before us. We learned the hard way. We thought we were furnishing the apartment, and they're not using 90% of the furniture we put in there. So I would encourage all of you to talk with someone who has already settled an Afghan family or two, and they can tell you the kind of furniture that's most useful, the kind of dishes they want, and you will save yourselves a lot of heartburn, and whatever money you spend will go a whole lot farther. So, talk to those that have been there before, or talk to other Afghan families who have been here for 6 months. And I guess the other big learning that Mary and I have is if you have access to a translator, which we do, use that translator like crazy. Our two families speak zero English, and you can imagine. And we've got a new baby that was born a couple of weeks ago, so medical appointments are just you got to use the translator, because what you think they understand when they nod yes, trust me, they don't understand it. They're saying, yes, I heard the words. When we were bringing the baby home, for instance, I got to pick up the baby at the hospital. It was wonderful. And the nurse is giving these discharge instructions, and mom is going, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And we got home with we had a translator there, but she wasn't asking questions, and I kept asking questions because she didn't she didn't know what ibuprofen was. She says, take ibuprofen for pain. Uh-huh. They don't know what it is. So do not assume that they're understanding what they're being told if they don't speak English. So just you've really got to step back and put yourself in a culture that this is so new and the language is so foreign to them. So use translators.
And also something we have found is that there's basically 2 classes. There's the very traditional women hide when other men came into the rooms, to the others that are much more westernized. So you need to find out where on the spectrum they lie.
So Mary and John, I really appreciate these concepts because they're so true. We're going to be doing a cultural series in March on these exact questions of the stuff and the needs that they have that are based on culture. So we do hope that you join us on Wednesdays in March for that. But I do want to make sure that we save space for questions about the grant or the fact that the boundary of finding a job is going to be the most essential thing that happens when they get on the ground, including all making sure their apartment is set up and so forth. Yes, Dave.
Um, the guy comes from Afghanistan and he gets a job earning $10 an hour. I would think he could not save money. So, but he's supposed to save money, and then after 3 months, he saves $3,000. Then the church gives him another 3,000. Is that how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, so right, exactly. So the way that a refugee office does it is that they are also paying for that person's rent for the first 6 months. And that's how the expectation is to save money. Is the refugee office pays the rent for 6 months, while that person works their $10 an hour job and saves their money. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the way that we do it in the church. If you can't afford to pay that 6 months rent while also providing match grant funds. Of course, if you applied for the funds through national, it's possible that you could get those funds from us. But the idea is that the rent is being paid, and that's how they're saving. Hope that answers your question.
Well, how might it work out in practice? So on March 1st, the guy says, okay, I'll do the $10 an hour job. And then you write a little contract. Okay, by June 1st, if you have saved $3,000 in somebody else's bank account, not his own,
Correct.
or you take his word for it. I have 3,000, or he's got to give 3,000 to the church.
He has to give $3,000 to the refugee office in the model that they use.
Oh.
And I can drop a link to the way the federal refugee office does it, but they actually double it. So every dollar that's put into that refugee office account, the feds put in two. But you could do it however you want. You can write it however you want. But the idea is go take that menial job, because they're not going to want the menial job. No one wants a menial job, because I'm so sorry.
Those your kids?
But so, I mean, in Middle Eastern, African cultures, if you work as a janitor, that's who you are. That's your identity. And in the United States, that's not necessarily so. I worked as a bartender through college. Did I want to be a bartender? Not really. But that's how I paid for getting into seminary, right? Because that's the model that we work with in the United States, in the West, that they won't understand the concept of. So being able to walk with them to understand that that's our cultural model and that they can thrive doing it that way, and that there's incentive to do it that way is going to be a really key thing to do.
Could you talk some more about the UCC grants and how we go about applying for those? Or send us a link?
Yeah, so I dropped the link to this new grant in the chat. That's for 2 Corinthians, which is a refugee empowerment grant designated for these purposes. There's also one other grant that's more on the resettlement topic that's been open for months. And that one is just to help get your family here and on the ground, and to work with partners. And I can follow up with you in an email about that grant. That grant's been open for a while. I hope the difference makes sense. So the first grant, the resettlement grant, is for the stuff that we're talking about with getting the stuff in the house and things all settled. And then the second grant that is brand new is about creating the empowerment so that they're self-sustainable.
And we just had a pretty healthy donation for the to help with our refugees program, and this has been very useful to me in that I think a good use of some of that money might be for us to do some internal grants that we sponsor using some of that money, because it will go a lot farther and do more of what we want to do in terms of moving them towards independence and self-sufficiency. So that might be a good use of some of that money rather than directly sponsoring another family, to use this as some kind of matching grant for the families that we have.
Definitely. So that's another part that I wrote into the grant, actually, is that if a church wants to do a three-way, a three-way grant with the family in which the family is expected to save $2,000, and the church provides $2,000 to match, and then you apply for $2,000 from the Second Corinthians Fund. Boom, there's $6,000. You can
Yeah.
pretty easily get a certification or a year of college for that.
Yeah, that'd be very cool.
Irene, can I ask a question?
Of
Um,
course.
We have a family that is needing to learn how to drive, and we don't have a DARI driver's manual in our state. Are there any other states that we could borrow one from to get them reading this, because they need to take the written test? They get to use a translator with the test, but I'm just wondering how the rest of you are approaching getting driver's licenses.
So I do know that there is a DARI driving manual that's out of Virginia. I forgot where I got that information from, but I will send it to you when I find it out there in the email ether world. That's my answer for you.
Okay, I can look state of Virginia, motor vehicles or something, right? Yeah.
And our families are both Pashto, so we have the same problem.
We are working with Catholic Charities, and they have had it in the past set up with a driving school that knows how to teach refugees. And so, but they have to pay for that out of their, what we call the welcome money. They have to pay for that amount.
That's great. So as per cars, refugee offices generally dissuade from getting cars right away for refugee families. First of all, for safety's sake, is that the rules of the road are way different in the United States, but also because a car is, I mean, that's an achievement. So if you have saved enough money or gotten enough autonomy over life that you can buy your own car and buy the car you want and it's yours, that is a big thing for a person to accomplish. And so taking that away from someone by just buying them a car, that's first of all one boundary problem to consider. And the other problem is that a lot of refugees like driving Uber because they don't have to necessarily interact much with the culture, and it matches their cultural standard of, you know, like I said, in the Middle East and in Africa, a lot of the economy is small business. And so the way that you make money is you have your small business. Uber is a small business. That's not the best way to make money in the United States because it doesn't have any sort of upward trajectory or benefits. And so often refugee offices will discourage buying a car for the purpose of Uber because it doesn't integrate into the culture and it doesn't have upward trajectory into a career. But you know, every family's different. But Match Grant will not fund Uber. If someone goes get a job doing Uber, then that does not count according to a refugee office because it's super common. Okay, someone asked a question in the chat. Must be part of the UCC? Yes. You can be, in order to apply for this grant, it can be an ecumenical partnership or an interfaith partnership, but at least one UCC congregation needs to be involved and be the primary applicant.
I see a question in the chat that we have overcome about keeping the name of the family confidential, but that the people in the congregation wanted to know more about them and welcome them. And we're working with Lutheran Family Services, and we ask them about the confidentiality, and they said as long as we were keeping the conversation within our congregation and not putting it on our Facebook page or out in the virtual world, that was fine to use the family name. And talk about, that the children were now going to school and that the father was getting some employment and the mother was learning to sew. And we were worried to give them some of those basic details, which satisfied our congregation to feel like they knew the family, even though they aren't coming to our church building yet. So you might just ask how far your resettlement agency will allow you to go in that regard.
Yeah, so HIPAA technically is states that anyone who has done a background check and signed up to be an official volunteer to work directly with that person can know their names. But also, if your refugee office tells you differently, then go with what they said, not me, like Linda said. So. So does everyone understand the match grant concept that I laid out and why it's important for folks to get a job and how to navigate that boundary with them about?
It looks like the match grant is only for people that are highly employable. If you have people with difficulties getting employment because of war injuries and language barriers and so forth, what's the path to help those folks?
Yeah, so refugee offices are usually more flexible with those folks. What we often saw happen was folks that were eligible for match grant but then opted not to take it had lots of community ties. So they had friends that were already in the United States that helped them find jobs, and they just kind of left the refugee office alone, or they took match grant. The other population, the one that you're talking about, folks with disabilities or low English and so forth, those were the kind of folks that would take more like 6 months to get a job, or that the refugee office would continue working with. But the tragedy is really just that after 6 months, it doesn't really matter what kind of refugee you are. You're out of a contract if you're not getting that job within 6 months. That being said, when I was providing match grant, I used to have this awful problem. It wasn't awful, it just was a problem, in that I would always select SIVs for the match grant because SIVs have great English, they have affluent careers, they have an understanding of American culture, but they just really didn't want to take that job as a janitor. And the deal was they had to take the first job offered to them, not the second or third one, the first one. And it was demeaning to them, reasonably so. And so they often would just decide to drop out of the program after I found them a job as a security guard, because that's not what they were expecting. They were expecting me to find them the job as an accountant, which I had explained that I wasn't going to get them because they're not certified as an accountant in the United States. So I stopped inviting SIVs into that program. Instead, I invited a lot of folks who didn't speak English because they were willing to go work in an Amazon packaging factory. And places like Amazon have safeguards for refugees and people who don't speak English, or other employers in which English isn't needed, or that typically employ them. So I would actually have more success, say, working with a Somali shopkeeper who didn't speak English than I did with an Afghan SIV when working at the refugee office, because the Somali shopkeeper wasn't dealing with the identity loss of not being an accountant anymore. That being said, we did have a lot of folks who are on the SIV, which means Special Immigrant Visa, which are mostly folks from Afghanistan and Iraq because they've served in the U.S. military, that really thrived on doing match grant. I actually had a gentleman in which I put him on match grant, and he went and found his own job as a what did he do? It was a high-level career. It was something fancy pants, like an engineer or something. I was like, there's no way you're gonna go get a job as an engineer. And he totally did, because I incentivized him to say, I'll pay your rent 6 months if you go find it, and I'll go find it for you. And he said, I don't want you to find, I'll find it. And he did. So okay, any other stories from the field? Anything folks are struggling with?
Irene, is there a way that we would know what success looks like here. So say we have somebody who says, yes, I'd like to do the matching grant. They save the money and they get the matching grant and advance their ability to work. Should there be some conversations earlier on or somewhere along the way that says, we think this is working if, for instance, you're able to sustain your family with housing, food, and transportation, or, what would that kind of picture, how do we navigate that picture of success together through that relationship with the family, allowing them to name that and then for us to work together on it?
Right, that's a good question. So, I mean, at a refugee office, when a person is invited to match grant, like I said, you have to take the first job that's offered to you. And if you don't do that, you are disqualified from the program, which means that your rent stops getting paid and the account that is meant for your savings closes. But people that did, that was rare. That did happen sometimes, but that was rare. But folks that did actually go get that job and start doing the match grant savings, they would the marker of success was that they stayed in that same job. They didn't bounce around. They stayed in the same job for 3 to 6 months while they collected the money and put it into the savings account that the refugee office held. And of course, they had to trust us with that, but it's a federal program in which they were able to check on it, right? Which might pose a different boundary with the church in which we're saving your money for you. So that's something that your congregation has to have a conversation about. But yeah, success means staying stably in the same job for 3 months. The refugee office will be very happy with you if you do that because they can bill for that. Does that answer your question, or is there something more?
Sorry, I think that answers the short-term question, but I guess I was looking at maybe a little longer-term question. Maybe if we look a year out, how do we define a successful relationship and resettlement here, and how do we, I would think that a key to that would be allowing the refugees to define what that would look like, and then
Totally.
together we work towards that goal.
Exactly. Yes. So, I mean, the most common use for match grant was to build their own business. Like I said, a lot of the other side of the world, it's small business models because you have control and autonomy, and you've created something. It's great. So we saw a lot of restaurants being built. A lot of Ethiopian, Afghan, Iraqi restaurants. They often enjoyed doing that. So it was always so wonderful a year or two out after they had done match grant for 6 months and saved $5,000 to $10,000 in relationship with us, and then they put a down payment on or got their licensure and started getting rent for and all the equipment for their new restaurant, and then we would go celebrate with them and eat at the restaurant. It was always really cool to see that happen.
Super.
So yeah, I mean the marker for success a year out is that this person is seeing themselves in the American context, which is you're thriving and you're doing a career that makes you happy and you're safe.
I'm curious how others and how you've made out we're being held up by our families are not, and a lot of families in this one complex are not getting their work authorization papers nor their social security numbers. So they can't go out and get a job. We're just stuck. And I mean, and that's squandering, a couple of months. Is that the experience of others or your experience?
Well, so this situation with Afghanistan is super unique, in which it was sort of a mishmash of getting 100,000 folks here all at once. So that doesn't surprise me. That is unusual for folks to not even have a social security number. The work authorization would sometimes take several weeks to come in, but if you have a social security number, you can apply for jobs. But if they don't
I'd be
have
happy. I'd be happy if several weeks. We're ready to start writing our senators and congressmen and have them put the heat on the Social Security Administration.
You know what, John? I apologize. I don't have an answer for you because that's so unique, but I also don't think it's unique to the situation. I actually have a meeting with Social Security next week, and I will ask that question and get back to you. Okay?
I would love that because it's really hamstringing us because they can't go to work and it's hard to even get open bank accounts.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of the women are getting the accounts opened in their names because their numbers come right through.
Yeah, that makes sense that their numbers would come through faster, actually.
Why does it make sense that women's numbers would come through faster than men's?
Oh, because they have a lot shorter vetting process for terrorism.
Oh,
That's good information.
Irene,
Hi.
in regard to measuring success, and it's very hard to measure anything. However, consider the church has $10,000 and they could say, okay, we're going to just write checks to the next 10 refugees who come across our path and we'll pay the first month's rents. Okay, and you do that. That's nice to pay the rent, right? Okay. Or you could say, we're holding $10,000 for one family and then save it and then help him get I don't know, goes to college for 2 years or he gets a truck driving license. So then, okay, so which is better? Do you have one family 10,000 to help the guy be an engineer or something, or just pay the rent? And is there a way to measure the success? Is we sort of just flying, I hate to say this, flying blindly? Like it seems like a good idea, but which is better? And how do we know which is better? Does the church have any plan to study this, to give a report, say in 2 years, this has been a success or it has not been? Why is this better than just writing checks for people who walk in the door?
That's a really big, important question, I think. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the family, right? I mean, there's lots of refugee families who would be better off.
No, I mean, in 3 years from now, when if the church is, I wonder, is the church planning to look back at this, say 2025, what has happened in the last 3 years? Is there any plan to measure it, to compare A versus B?
To follow
Who's
up
in
with
charge? Yeah, who's in charge of doing that and how would they measure success?
Oh,
There's no
well,
plan for that?
I can certainly make one. That sounds like a
Well,
great idea.
But right now, there is no written plan, no numerical test for 2022, 2023, 2024. So we're sort of gambling, right? This is going to be a good program, right?
Yeah, I suppose
Okay.
so.
Oh, okay. Well,
I mean,
should
it's go ahead.
Well, it's a good program, but why is this better than other programs? And shouldn't the church try to measure and compare programs?
Sure. I mean, statistically, this is the best program that refugee offices use to sustain employment, and which is why I'm suggesting to replicate it. But it doesn't work for everyone, right? If a family comes over and they're totally cool with taking the janitor job, that's great too. So.
Okay, this is my last point. But today, here it is, February 10th. There's no written plan to measure this, for example, February 2025. Is that true?
No, there is not.
That's false.
But...
Oh, you
No,
agree
no.
with me?
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
agreeing with you.
Okay, so today there's no plan to measure success. Is that fair to say? There's no plan.
Correct.
That's correct. That's not.
I would say
that's not good, is it? That's not good, is it?
I guess
fly by blindly without thinking about the future.
I would offer maybe Irene, you're in the same place, but we've been trying to this came really fast, right? So 100,000 Afghan refugees hitting the ground, and we're doing our best to serve them. And you're raising a good point. And yeah, let's look at that. Appreciate that.
Correct. Yes.
I think it's critical to understand that at the core of all of this, which you've brought up several times, Irene, is relationality. And it's hard to measure a relationship. But if we, enter into relationship with these newcomers and we develop those relationships, I think that's really the critical piece. And I think it has all kinds of possibilities surrounding it for the future. And you know, when those relationships are established, then possibilities happen, because those relationships engender support for dreaming, for hoping into the future. So
Exactly. This
another
is very
perspective.
true.
Irene, just a question about, will you be sending out the tape of this, a copy of the boundary piece?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
I have a question, Irene, and it's a more practical question. We're getting our family of 10 on Saturday, and I've had a problem finding information for budgeting because, you know, we're hoping to support this family at least a year, possibly longer. I think it will take a higher salary to support a family of 10 as well. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, how much is available for them through the agency versus support that we will give them. So is there some guidance on that so we can develop a true budget?
Yeah, I mean, I would err on the assumption that the agency doesn't have any money for you, but you have to ask that agency. They possibly have grants that they have for that, but that's dependent on your local agency. But, you know, a family of 10 is going to have TANF, they're not, and food stamps, right? So they'll get a monthly allowance from Social Security, and they'll get food stamps that will supplement that, which isn't very much money, but whatever that amount is, you could budget in as well. I don't know the exact number that a family of 10 receives for either of those, but I would make a gentle assumption that that's all they're going to get.
I was told that I have documents that show how much should go to a local agency of the total amount, that part of it goes to the resettlement agency, and then they're required to spend a certain amount of that on the refugee family in their local setting.
Yeah, a lot of refugee offices do that. It's for good faith that the church won't run out on them. So they ask you, is that what you're talking about, where they ask you for some money and they put it into their account and disperse it to the refugee?
No, that there's a certain amount that the agency gets to support the refugee, and the bulk of that goes to the agency for their own expenses, and then another part of it is spent to pay rent for the refugee family and their utilities and so forth.
Yes, you're right. I apologize. That's almost nothing though in the inflation environment that we're living in. That total amount I think is $2,275. And I think half of that goes to overhead for the refugee office, and the other half goes to the refugee, which is like $1,000 something.
But that's per person.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Correct. Yes, you're right. My apologies.
Okay.
You're correct.
Okay.
John, let me know if I'm off on this. Catholic Charities is paying each of our families apartment rent for a year. They also get food stamps because they qualify. And our food stamp budget for a family of 8 was around $1,000 a month, which is not bad for a family of 8. And then they also get health care, what we call Sooner Care here in Oklahoma. And so it's basically Medicaid, which, you know, really takes a big bite out of, you know, what the family has to pay for. But they're in about a year, then they're going to be hit with those numbers.
Correct.
Okay. So I think our families are getting, as a SIV are getting much more than just a regular refugee would get. Significantly more.
I mean, technically they don't. That might be the practice of your local office though, which is great.
I guess it is, because that's what they're getting. Now, I can't say the apartment's all that great.
Irene, do you know what the term SQSI parolee means versus parolees without SQ/SI?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Thank you. I've tried to find out what that means and I can't find it. So thank you.
All right. Well, if no one has any other questions, you are welcome to email me or call me with anything that comes up later. And I certainly appreciate all of you for doing this really vital work of taking on such a big, intense project that my hope is going to be a beautiful journey of hope and renewal for both you, your church, and your family that you're sponsoring. And, you know, I will send a follow-up email that has both the resettlement grant that does the basic, offers money for the basic resettlement in a partnership. And then the other new grant that offers this empowerment funding that serves as an incentive, because I know everyone's focused right now on setting up apartments and welcoming people at the airport, but very, very soon it's going to turn into now you got to go get a job. It happens extremely quickly. So I'm preparing you for that next leg of the journey.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a useful meeting, especially the matching grants. That's got real potential for us to use very effectively here. And we will pass that on to others who aren't associated with UCC.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.